The Northwest home for paranormal. You're listening to U.S. Phenomenon with your host, Mario Magana.
From the Pacific Northwest in the shadow of the 1962 World's Fair, the Space Needle. Good evening. I'm your host, Mario Magana. This is U.S. Phenomenon. You can be a part of the show by texting our studio hotline or calling it as well, 775-990-5151. You can subscribe to the podcast as well and get exclusive content that you don't hear or see on the radio or stream experience. Tonight, our guest is a director for security training for Fortune 300 companies. Katherine Schwiet is a former FBI special agent and former head of the FBI active shooter program, also an author of Stop the Killing and How to End the Mass Shooting Crisis. It is my pleasure to welcome to U.S. Phenomenon, Katherine Schwiet. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Hi, I'm very pleased to be here. I'm excited. I'm hoping to be in Seattle shortly. So,
you got to come up, and if you do, please let me know. I'll send us some recommendations your direction.
Count on it.
Okay, so in the headline news, I mean, it's so interesting. I don't want to say normal now. It's like we see it all the time. It happens all the time. And there was an active shooter here. There was an active shooter there. Why is this? Is it really the fame that these individuals are looking for? What is it what is it? Why?
What is it? That's the most common question that I get, Mario. What and why? What and why? And I mean, the why really, what really is part of the reason. You have to know what in order to get to why, because we see all this news coverage about all of these shootings, but they're really different situations, right? I mean, it's kind of like one's a Buick, one's a Ford, one's a Chevy. Right. So they're different situations, and a lot of the killings that go on in the United States that are firearms related, more than half of them, nearly 2 out of 3 are suicides. So most of the firearms injuries, more than half of them, right, are suicides. And then there's a certain number of them that are homicides. And the homicides, the bulk of them are these individuals and gangs and drugs and domestic violence. And then a teeny tiny number of ones that get all the press coverage are what we consider active shooters, or some people, you can also define in some ways, you can define a lot of them as mass shootings. There's no legal definition for mass shooting, but a lot of different organizations in both government and in private industry, particularly the media, quantify the shootings and say, oh, if there's 3 or more people killed, that's a mass shooting. Or if there's 4 or more people, that's a mass shooting. The FBI says if it's an active shooter, as long as somebody's moving, as long as somebody is actively engaged in trying to kill people, they don't care how many people you actually kill. Because that's, to me, as a former law enforcement officer, that's just a question of how good of a shot you are. So I'm not going to limit my number count based on whether 2 died or 3 died.
Oh, I mean, it's unfortunate that anyone has to die in these circumstances. And we'll talk about someone who worked for a television station back in the as a broadcast engineer. The story always goes, if it bleeds, it leads. And it's unfortunate that it has, I mean, the tip of the iceberg, going back to even like, I guess dating myself, like there was never this situation when I was going through high school. And I mean, okay, so I graduated in 97. Okay. So,
well, you know what, I'll tell you that, Mario, they do these kinds of shootings really, they do go back in the United States. To go back, we saw some in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, and some in, Columbine was 1989, right? And by then it was kind of established that, boy, these law enforcement had to respond faster to get to these shooters. That was one of the biggest lessons about Columbine. And some of the other shootings, that you're a West Coaster. There was a shooting in the 70s at San Ysidro, California, and down near the Mexico border. A terrible shooting at a McDonald's down there, where law enforcement didn't respond as fast as now they would. But you're not wrong to think that the numbers are increasing, because 2 years ago, 3 years ago, the FBI counted 30 of these types of shootings a year that were the kind of shootings that you think of as Columbine or Sandy Hook. And then the next year it was 40. And the year after that, which was just 2021, there were 61 incidents using the same criteria. So the number of them are absolutely increasing. And the why, which is really what you asked me, and how, that's the
Right.
$64,000 question of why. There's lots of reasons, and we're still kind of plowing through what those are. But I honestly, I assure your listeners, we're in a better spot than we were before, even though it doesn't seem like it, because the numbers are going up. It's like I'm selling you soap water or something, but I promise it's getting better. But the media plays a role. Happy to talk to you about that.
Yeah, and something that let's go back to, let's just talk about the 80s. Growing up in the 80s and 90s, video games, things of that nature, not as real as they are now. Would we think of like a James Bond or some of these, this is how dated I am, that I don't even play video games, or I was even allowed to have a toy gun in the house. It was not
Right.
that was just the way I was brought up. And even for Christmas this year, my nephew gave me a toy gun. I was like, I can't have a toy gun. Dad said
Yeah.
I could have a gun as a kid.
Right.
And that still, plays to does that factor into this case where we're talking about video games that have like an active shooter, like a James Bond or
Sure.
you
Well,
know,
I think that there are more things. There are things that are more impactful. There's a ton of research that's gone on for a long time that talks about, are video games things that make people more violent? Is it something that creates violence or encourages somebody to be more violent? And all the research says no. I mean, the United States has actually, at the last study I saw, 48% of the video game players were women. Of these types of shootings that we fear the most in the schools and the malls and the churches and the libraries and out in public parks, almost exclusively men. 99 of the 61 from 2021, 60 of them were men. One was a female. So it's a man's game in terms of going out and shooting publicly. That's what we saw this week in California. When I was out in California, I just flew home and had been out both in the Monterey Bay, Monterey Park area, and Alhambra, and in the I think twice. I'll figure it out. Where the other shooting was. I'll think of it. I'll think of it in just a minute. There have been so many shootings, I can't keep them all straight all the time. But the video games, there isn't really evidence, and there's in fact a lot of research that shows not video games. That's not a precursor. That's not a predictive value. Just like mental health issues are not a predictive value. It may seem like it, but they're not.
and because play, like I said, playing Duck Hunt of the back in those days or whatever, and this is like the same thing. My dad was like, no, you cannot have Duck Hunt. I was like, well, I want to play that game, because that was just the way we grew up, not having that piece introduced into our daily routine, I guess.
I think that's typical, though. I think there were a lot of kids who were raised. I raised two girls, and I didn't want them to have toy guns and run around and play cops and robbers. But you know what? When I was a kid, we did. We played cops and robbers, and we played with little green army men, from the grocery store that mom and dad brought home, and we played Battleship and Stratego and all those games that are essentially war games that our parents invented after they all came home from World War II.
Right. I mean, you played cops and robbers, or even the superhero piece where someone was the bad guy. And I think that when I look at all these, I think we all look at them and we're like, okay, does owning a gun play into a fact where, if they were to remove guns and say, you know what, guns are no longer be a part of the United States, you can no longer own a firearm. How do you see that playing into our future?
Would we have less shootings, a really small number of shootings in the United States? Absolutely, we would. We know that because from the international, like Adam Langford's research internationally, we know that in locations where it's very difficult to get a gun or to have a gun. It isn't that they don't have guns, but it's a different system. A lot of countries that have limited the number of guns that they have They also tightly control who gets them by making you fill out a form or making you be interviewed and evaluating that every once in a while, and maybe every few years, talking to your neighbors maybe or your family. If you have a problem domestically or at school or something, a weapon might be taken out of the house. Different countries have done that. And certainly, if we didn't have the volume of guns here, we wouldn't have the volume of shootings we have here. But I will say, as a person who teaches a class on the Second Amendment for DePaul University's law school, we have them. And we have more guns in the United States than we have people. So if there's 320 million-ish people in the United States and an estimated 400 million-ish guns. Estimates only because there is no registration. There's no way to keep track of them. Most of the many guns, even the homemade and handmade guns, there's no way to actually even identify that they exist.
It's interesting because I don't want to say that owning a gun is sexy, because, some people own them, some don't.
Sure.
And to have that right to, carry, or even during the pandemic, watching, going to Chipotle, going to, fast food, casual fast food, whatever you want to call that, going into the restaurant and the guy, not wearing a mask, fine. This is, in the middle of the pandemic, but he was open carrying in the state of Washington. You're allowed to open carry. Now, was it a little excessive for a burrito? Heck yeah. A little over for a burrito. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but that's the challenge, isn't it? Like every every community, there's fantastic arguments on both sides. I know people who are adamant about they want to just get all the guns in the United States gone and melted down. And then I know people who are like, there aren't enough guns in the United States. If we had more guns and if we were allowed to carry more openly in more places, we would never have any firearms violence. And I don't think either of those are practical, and I certainly don't think the latter is sensible. If a lot more guns were going to make us a lot safer, we'd be the safest country in the world.
And when you talk about that, because I was going through my head of one of the active shooters that I think that most stuck with me was the grocery store incident, and I don't remember, sometime last year, sometime.
Super.
I was blown away. I was like in shock, like stone cold, like blown away by just.
Yeah. What is it that shocked you about that? Okay, that would be interesting for me to hear.
I mean, a grocery store, why? What the purpose of going in there and extinguishing lives at a grocery store? Like,
right.
I find, I'm like, to me now, it's like, and we'll talk about this in the second half. I have a plan every time I go somewhere. Where's my exit strategy? Where am I?
Plan. That's good. I like to hear that.
I mean, everyone should, regardless if you carry a gun or you don't. How are you getting out of a situation? We're talking grocery store now. I got to have a plan to get out, and I got to hide behind the produce section.
Well, let me just tell you one thing. When we initially started after Sandy Hook, when I started the FBI's active shooter program, we didn't really know what we would find. And I worked with a tremendous number of people, a group and analysts, and we tracked down all the active shooter incidents over a 14-year period. And half of those were in places of business. Only a quarter of them were in schools. And the number of school incidents has actually gone down percentage-wise since then. So this is a threat that is in a place of business. You should expect it in a mall, in a packing facility where you work, in the grocery store, because that's where these shootings happen. Or in the parking lots outside.
Yeah, and I think maybe the reason, and I didn't explain this either, but once upon a time, I bagged groceries for a part-time gig, and in my high school days, and I think that took me back to that, that time in my life. I was like, wow. I mean, I was like, I could have been.
Who would think?
Yeah, you would think, right? Who would think? And as we talk about this, are we talking about? And I know you said this earlier, but is this more of because are we seeing an active, higher volume of shootings? Not as much as we have in the past, but because of the pandemic, is this? You wouldn't say that this is pandemic related because people are not going to, therapy or.
I think that there are a number of causes, right? that the number of firearms deaths, firearms injuries in the United States is high, and it's always been pretty high. And it hasn't risen exponentially like these active shooters have, active shooting situations have. And we did see a spike in homicides during the pandemic. And I don't know that, when you say, well, what caused that? Of course, there's a lot of causes, but the essence of what prompts firearms violence is often, anger and frustration and anxiety. And so couple that with of gun availability, people being home, people being around each other, you have much more likely chance of getting killed if you're in a home with a gun than if you're not in a home with a gun, which is probably a very controversial thing to say, but the research shows that. So we had people at home who were frustrated and had a lot of anxiety, and that did prompt an increase in the homicides. But firearms injuries have always been, or firearms deaths, casualties have always been, pretty steady.
And for someone who, let's just say, once upon a time, regardless of what I believe in regard, like I don't want to say if I carry or I don't carry, just because if I'm in
Sure.
public, I don't need someone knowing what my situation may be. But I will tell you that I grew up in a neighborhood that had gangs. It was not a great neighborhood, and then living in a really nice established neighborhood here in Seattle, it was like I hear more gunshots now than I ever did in the hood. And I say the hood because I feel like I grew up and, you had Bloods and Crips, walking the streets and trying to steal backpacks. What's interesting to me is I told my dad, I was like, I can't believe I'm hearing all these shootings in West Seattle, drive-bys, or just, 9 rounds gone off in like down the street, and it seems to be happening. I'm like, where am I? I'm like, is this the alternative 1985 from Back to the Future? I make that reference because it was chaos.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That was you go, when that scene hits in the movie and you're like, well, our world is not like that, and it's never going to be like that. And then suddenly you feel like you're living in it. It is a little crazy. I think there's a lot of reasons why the numbers have changed, but a lot of reasons why we see the violence differently. I think that it's covered more. Remember, we are living in a 24-hour news cycle now, and now we're living in a 24-hour endless internet and social media world where everything is discussed and debated and discussed and debated and discussed and debated. And quite frankly, maybe we tell the truth about it, maybe we don't. And in the world of social media, it's, hey, how come nobody's talking about that shooting on 7th Avenue? So then there's more people chatting on social media about the shooting on 7th Avenue that we probably never would have heard before.
And I was just looking up to see on the top of my head how many active shooters have there been already for 2023. I know in Seattle it's pretty high already.
Well, and let me tell you, that's a good, I'm glad you say that because I don't know what numbers you have, but let me tell you the numbers that you see and the way that the news covers this. I work with network news, major news sources a lot, and we've had discussions about what they're covering and what numbers they're using. The number of incidents has not spiked in January, but if you read the news coverage, it would appear that it has, because they're pulling numbers out of these relatively new databases, and they're pulling raw numbers every time. And I guess maybe a great example of it would be, I was going to say, every time a gun is discharged. And a good example of it would be if you looked at some of the organizations, because there are some great, like Northeastern and USA Today and Associated Press have a great database. K through 12 is a great database, but K through 12's database is anytime a gun is discharged at a school or around a school. There's a lot of difference between a Sandy Hook and a janitor who accidentally discharges his weapon as he's climbing out of his car.
Great point, because I mean, for those who are not skilled or trained there's probably a metric ton of individuals who aren't fully trained to properly carry a gun, or they have an incident where it's they shoot themselves, or an active round goes off. I find it very hard to believe in the year 2023. Did I say that right? Wow, that's weird.
That sounds weird.
That the violence trend still is around. Like, this ain't, I can't even imagine that someone of any stature would be why we may have accepted this as the norm. Because when you look at the big picture, those who are gun toters and people who believe in the Second Amendment, and hey, I believe in it. By all means, you want to carry a gun, carry a gun. You don't. The question then becomes, how do we reduce the risks? And I know that we're going to talk about that in the second half, but how do we get through there?
No, I think that's a good point. I mean, I think that's right. Isn't that the money shot? The money shot is how do we prevent it? And because like I mentioned about the databases, I think if you type mass shooting in and you're looking for a database, you're not going to get a database of mass shootings, but it's going to look like it is. And that's kind of the mistakes that some of the networks and the major media sources did, once these shootings started in the beginning of the year, and they were saying, oh, there've been hundreds of shootings in the first 2 weeks in January. Yeah, there's hundreds of shootings every first 2 weeks in January, because gang and drugs and domestic violence and all kinds of other things that this, cause injury and death with firearms. But I think we are down the road on some ways that we can, that I think we're going to be able to see. When you say, well, nothing's been done, which I know you didn't say, but let me just put those words in your mouth. I think that for example, a lot of states have passed a lot of laws just on a simple thing like requiring, weapons to be properly secured. If more than half, as much as 2 out of 3 firearms deaths are caused, are suicides, the answer to that is to lock your damn guns up.
For sure.
Right. To think, and then exponentially think about who has access to that weapon and what is their mental state, and know about suicide, and save your life and the life of your loved ones.
When we come back, our guest tonight, Katherine Schwiet, we're going to get into what the active shooter role and like the training that you've done. And I'm going to share my experience with everyone. And if you have an experience that you want to share with us, maybe you've been in some training, or, you watched a video from, your day of whatever, whoever's out there listening, you can be a part. You can send your text or call us. The studio lines is open at 775-990-5151. We're going to check in with Mark Christopher for our paranormal story of the week, not to be missed. And we'll be back. You're listening to US Phenomenon. All right, welcome back to the show. Our guest tonight, Katherine Schwiet, who has a stellar resume. I say this because I'm going through the sweats right now, because we're going to talk about some stuff. You have a book that's out, talking about, because you are an author. You're a title of many. You're a lady with many titles.
I mean, it means I can't hold a job, Mario.
I don't know if that. I mean, that means that you're like consultant heavy, right? You got in the.
I'm pretty busy. I'm pretty busy.
So thank you for taking the time. Your book is called
Stop the Killing: How to End the Mass Shooting Crisis. And I have a podcast, actually. Books cost money, but podcasts are free. So I have a podcast called Stop the Killing, and it's for civilians. It's for citizens. So we talk about shootings, and then we talk about solutions.
So for everyone who's in, and we talked about this earlier, if you didn't listen and you need to go back, go subscribe to the podcast or watch the stream. We talked about this earlier, about how we're going to get to this piece now, where most people get their active shooting training from work. And you said most active shootings are now happening in the business, not at schools, but in the business. Now, I work for a tech company outside of, this glorious, stream podcast show, radio show, stream, however you want to call it. Now, in this training, I haven't had this since my Police Explorers days, when we're going through And I'm just even talking about this right now, I'm getting the sweats.
Yeah.
And in this company that I work for, it's a cool tech company. It's got a lot of glass everywhere. So we
Mhm.
have a lot of glass hanging out. And I'm like, I watched this video. This video to me made me sweat. It was so real like.
I'm not
This
sure which one you saw, because there are a handful of them out there, but,
if I find it, I'll write down the thing. But I just remember watching this. I left
was
after.
it in a place of business? Was it in a
Yes,
bar? Was
no,
it
it
in
was
a
in a place of business, and the active shooter had a short barrel.
Oh, yeah, that's the original Run, Hide, Fight video developed by the City of Houston Mayor's Office
Yes,
and done on a DHS grant, and I called the mayor's office back at right after Sandy Hook and said, "Can we push this out nationally and make this the national messaging for Run, Hide, Fight?"
man,
Um,
I
that's
was
my fault that you were sweating, sorry.
for real, because for those who haven't had the opportunity to see this video or done some type of active training, working in TV, we always had the scenario like what happens. We have these remote buttons, active shooter underneath the desk. They were everywhere, in the radios pod, where every radio and TV station or studio had the active shooter wireless activation button. It would
Right.
trigger. Seattle SWAT would come out. The roll gate would come down up in the studios, lock them down. Now, that was just like going through that. Now, actually watching this video put me in a place where I was like, holy smokes, where am I going in a beautiful tech company
Right.
that and I know that there's got to be a panic room somewhere, but I'm like, there's no panic room for me.
And the answer and actually that's right. I mean, the answer is just what you're doing. You're thinking about it now because you won't be able to think about it when it happens. And that video is called Run, Hide, Fight. You can find it on my website, katherineschwiet.com. You can find it on the FBI's. You can find it on the City of Houston site in about 12 languages. I think that maybe it's 10. So, and training materials too. And that what the whole essence of that, the essence of the entire training is it's a 6-minute video and we want you to think ahead of time so that if something bad happens, just like if you see a fire breakout or anything else, that you will immediately know what to do. I mean, we haven't lost a kid in a school fire since the 1950s in the United States, and we still run fire drills several times a year. So people will know exactly what to do. And
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but going through that piece, we're watching the video and it just looks so real. The actors and actresses, laying on the ground, fake blood. I was like, wow, this is intense. I was like, so when we were going to lunch, I was like, man, this video is intense. And he goes, right. And I was like, by the way, where are we going? I'm like, I was like, I'm like, what? We're gonna head, roll over the desk and hide behind that. I'm like, we're getting blown away.
The answer is you run. If you can run, get out. You can't be shot if your feet get you out the door and down the block.
Right.
Don't stay in a building because you want to run back to an office and hide in a closet. If you can get out of the building, it's safer to get out of the building and get away. And I know that a lot of people argue back and forth about, if I run, then the shooter's going to aim at me. Well, the shooters don't do that. I'm telling you, 25 years of research tells me that the shooters are in the building looking for who they want or in the parking lot looking for who they want. Their adrenaline is pumping. They're not necessarily a great shot, but they're firing at the people who are near them. And they're not looking to, hit somebody 200 yards down the street who's running.
Right. And being somewhere, okay, so again, being experienced, here's a scenario. Someone who I still am a broadcast engineer by trade, going to the nightclub to, broadcast at the nightclub, the discotheque, whatever you want to call it, the nightclub. And there was something happened where the celebrity was hitting on some dude's girl. Guy came back. We were packing up. We're in the station vehicle to leave.
Mm-hmm.
And I kid you not, 6 rounds, boom, 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 boom. And he was parallel to the vehicle that I was
Wow.
in, and I could feel the percussion of the shot. At that
Yeah.
point, I was like, "Oh my god, I've been hit." But I like went like this. I didn't see anything. But he
Yeah.
had shot in the nightclub, hit a patron. This became something as a broadcast engineer that happened to me not once, not twice, but 3 times.
Well, see, you're better prepared than others because you understand the way that probably most people listening do not necessarily understand how loud, how loud it is when you're standing right near somebody who's shooting. But when we go to the range, we wear, sound canceling headsets. Um, you it is so loud, and the feeling of it. And if it's dark out, there's like fire that comes out of the muzzle of the gun. I mean, it's if you recall, down in Florida at the high school at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida,
Right.
their shooting occurred in a building that had 3 floors of classrooms in it, and the fire alarm went off, and some people thought early on that the fire alarm had been pulled by somebody. It wasn't. It was the smoke from the gun that set the fire alarm off, the gun that was being used. So it's very confusing, and it's very um, disorienting because of the noise and the sounds. And think about in movie theater, a Batman movie running at the Aurora Theater when that shooting started at the beginning of that movie.
Oh,
But I'll tell you, from the standpoint of time, here's why we want you to train to run, hide, or fight, in that order. Run if you can, because the FBI research shows that 70% of these shootings end in 5 minutes or less. And half of that 70%, 2 minutes or less. You just need a few minutes to keep yourself safe.
and that's all it takes, right? You just
Right.
need 2 minutes to be able to say, "Hey, look, well, I mean, you just got to react. It's not like you're thinking. You need to go."
What
At this,
happens, right? And what happens a lot of times is that people freeze. And that's natural, right? You freeze. But our natural instinct is also, fight or flight. If you're not going to fight, get your feet moving. Get out of there. Because, when you lay down on the ground, we see people go down to the ground. When you lay down on the ground, a bullet that is fired from a gun will skip across the ground until it finds something. All you do by crouching down on the ground or laying on the ground is give the bullet a better target.
it's scary to me that to think that you have the ability to get the heck out of there, but you don't want to be in that situation where you're like, "Ugh," you freeze up. You got to just be reactive. Now, because you're a professional and we're going out here, I mean, stop the killing. How are we going to make this happen? Is it going to be more regulation? Is that really what's going to take
Well,
this?
I think it's a combination of things. I mean, the regulation is going to be, city by city, state by state, some cases nationally. There was a firearms law passed, passed and signed by President Biden in the summertime that was more comprehensive. Big, and we haven't seen anything like that in more than a decade, at least. Um, I'm pretty familiar with the firearms laws that have been passed, and there are systems in place now that weren't in place before. It's hard to believe, but there was no registration system there was no background check system. There was none of that, existed, 30, 40 years ago. So there are some things in place like background checks that are in place now, but the package that the president signed is really a kind of a mixture of things. It's more money to provide mental health services in schools and mental health services in counties, which are always like woefully, inadequate. And that way, when somebody comes in and they're under duress and they can't service them, then that person goes home, right? So part of it is there's more mental health care, potentially money out there for mental health care. But there's also hard and fast things about weapons, changes in the rules, minor changes, but changes in the rules for people ages 18 to 21. It used to be that if you wanted to purchase a gun and you were 20 years old, you could go in and buy the gun, and the FBI NICS system, the instant background check system that they have that's used nationally,
Mhm.
and states also have systems that they use. But if the background wasn't completed in 3 days, it was deemed to be okay, and you got your gun. And so it was kind of a 72 hours or, walk away. What we had is some instances where we had individuals under the age of 21 who purchased weapons, and then we discovered, I don't mean we, the FBI, but I think we as a whole, the population, we realized that these individuals had mental health diagnoses and had, in some cases, activities, criminal activities or violence tendencies and things that were never reported to the NICS system. And the NICS system is based on what is reported to it. And anybody who has domestic violence, a mental health that's been diagnosed, a mental health issue that's been diagnosed, where a doctor has deemed that person to be a potential harm to themselves or others, certain criteria, those are all great as long as the reporting agency gets the information into the background system. But we find that a lot of times that doesn't happen. So some of the federal stuff that the president signed, mandates that mental health things be placed into the NICS system, changes that rule so that you can't just get your gun at 20 because the background couldn't be done in 3 days. Instead, they mandate that the person who's running the background go back to the state and local community to see if there are state and local records. So just a bunch of pieces of things that I think bit by bit, different states have passed a lot of laws that have to do with the number of, ammunition you can put in a magazine, the amount of ammunition that can be sold. I think I'm in Virginia where there's a 1 gun a month rule instead of you can buy every once in a while. Now, keeping in mind that, you can buy nothing in Chicago, in Illinois, but you can buy everything in the states around it. And that's the same problem that, California has stricter rules, but you can buy everything in states around it. And there's no prohibition from transmitting state to state. So that's the challenge with not having national rules.
And if said national database of, let's say, I've decided that, you know what, I'm going to buy a new gun. And then I would go through the process of purchasing said new gun, maybe, 9mm, and I would go through the national background check, and they would go through and say, you know what, he's good to go. But does training deem to be a part of this as to carry the license, to just like a driver's license, you have to get a battery test, like a skill set test? Is that what we're looking for here in the future for said gun owners? Maybe like in state of Washington, there's a boating license now.
Right.
If you hit this threshold, they just know that the older seniors are out. They're going to carry a gun. They're carrying a gun, but they're grandfathered in. And then anyone born after X amount of day, then they have to do a full license. You got to take the training. You got to you got to pass the training to carry a gun, if it's for hunting or if it's,
for sport, right?
Whatever.
But that's just the will of the people though, right? I mean, that's the problem with it. We want the solutions, but we don't want it to impose on our rights. And the majority of gun owners, as we know in the United States, properly handle their guns and, properly train. And it's that unending question of, why do I have to wear a seatbelt? I'm not going to get in a car accident. And it's for that one time you do. Why do I have to get a driver's license when I'm a safe driver? The piece of paper doesn't show that I'm a good driver, and it doesn't prove that I'm a good driver and a safe driver. It's just a piece of paper. And a lot of gun owners see that with regard to training. They say, I would never let my child go out hunting with me unless that child was properly trained. We go to the range for fun. I know a million people who have guns. I think it's probably safe to say that, since we know there's 400 million guns out there. I know so many people who have guns, and they I spent 20 years in the FBI carrying a gun. So, I was properly trained, but it properly trained and a proclivity to be a violent actor are separate items.
And for those who are, would say, and we hear this 100 times. I mean, I know you have. Well, if you take my guns away, If you take all the guns away, the enemy or the bad guy is still going to have access to guns.
I hear that. Sure.
Isn't that the $1 million question? They always say, everyone says this.
It's one of many. I think it's always, it's always you ask you if they want peanut butter and jelly, and then they tell you about their salami sandwich. They're two different issues. I mean, taking all the less guns, it's kind of, there's a lot of myths out there, and it's there, I mean, I could tick off the list of myths, and there would be, and the people who aren't mad at me now will be mad when I say good guy with a gun. No, we have like 6 times more interruptions of shootings by civilians unarmed than armed. The idea that it's all mental health. No. The idea that if we get rid of the guns, then they'll just kill with other things. No, the evidence doesn't show that. And take away the guns, and any place where it's a no gun zone, that's where all the killings occur. No, we have plenty of data that shows that those are arguments that are made that aren't valid. But I think that really takes away from the discussion about prevention. What do we want to do to prevent shootings? Well, it is wise to think about where do we allow and what kind of guns do we allow in what areas, what are safe spaces. You can't carry a gun into the White House. As an agent, I couldn't carry a gun into the White House. It was one of the few places I couldn't carry a gun. So having rules and regulations and some levels of restrictions is an acceptable thing from us, even with regard to the Second Amendment. For pretty much everybody, they believe that people who, the most ardent supporters of the Second Amendment believe that people who have mental health issues and are under mental health stress and might want to commit suicide should have their guns taken away in one way or another. But they even argue about how that should be done, And so it's not the fact that, the guns are out there. Of course, we have these killings because of the guns, but the solutions to them, we really have divergent opinions on what those solutions are in order to manage those guns.
And I think you already answered my question, talking about in regards to like cities that predominantly have banned, firearms from and having high crime rate in this area. Obviously, that being because said individuals are carrying illegal guns in a, if it's gangs or however that, if it's a robber or whoever said person is, you already answered the question. I was like, well, how,
Well, a great example when you say cities, I have a good friend who is an area commander in Chicago. So she's a high ranking police officer in Chicago. And Chicago is right practically on the border of both Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin. Everything is within an hour's drive or less.
Right.
Even Iowa, right, is not that far away. And those other states have varying laws about guns. And those are the guns that a lot of those guns are coming into the city, and they're taking handguns off of kids. And the kids who are holding the handguns, it used to be that the gang had, when I worked drug cases as a prosecutor in Chicago, it used to be that the gangs had, a couple of guns, and there was one person in the gang whose job it was to hold the guns and then hand them out when they were needed for drive-bys and things like that and robberies. And, now everybody's carrying a gun, and there's more gun availability. And they're also younger. So we have a lot more minors carrying guns. It's harder when you think about it from a prosecution standpoint. 13-year-olds, they're getting involved in a shooting, but then their activity is in juvenile court. And then one other thing is ghost guns, which is, a term that I know you're familiar with, which are the guns that are manufactured essentially at home by buying the parts individually and doing some of your own homemaking activities with it. The firearm doesn't have a registration number on it. There's no way to see where it came from, not even to know whether or not it's properly manufactured or it's safe. And I was just reading yesterday that in 2017, I think ATF responded to 1,700. In 2017, they responded to 1,700 investigative inquiries about things that would be these homemade manufactured guns, what we call ghost guns. In 17, in 18, in 19, that number had risen to 20,000. So 1,700 to 20,000. And by 2021, that number was 40,000, more than 40,000,
And,
45.
and for someone who doesn't know what a ghost gun is, if you have watched the movie In the Line of Fire, John Malkovich builds himself a composite ghost gun to, go after who was the president of the United States in that movie in The Line of Fire. So if you haven't seen the ghost gun, you can go watch that movie, and Malkovich and everyone else can make a little money. But what's interesting,
and they're trickier. You can make them with a 3D printer, but they're also very volatile, so they can explode in your hands. And anyway,
I think when we talk about prevention, and the book that you have out now, Stop the Killing, here's something for you. Is it like a program that we put back in the school system, like a DARE, or something that maybe it's not like DARE, but it's like DARE because that was, drug related? And I mean, I was a part of that program, but is there something that we could use to start at the younger age for to stop the violence, to the prevention?
Well, you know what? I love that you asked me that, because the most hesitation that I've dealt with when I was on this White House team was from the Department of Education. There is a denial on the part of educators at some times to say, we can't talk about this, it's too scary for the students. But now what we have are students who learn to run, hide, fight in lockdown in schools, and now they're in business, right? They're all grown up and they survived. And if you went to Colorado, for instance, you would see that Colorado is a good example. In Connecticut, where Sandy Hook is, the kids at Sandy Hook had active shooter training a few weeks before their shooting. So training is very possible at a younger age. You just train to the level that you're talking about, right? I mean, it's people who disagree with that. I would say to them, do you own a firearm? And they would say, if they said yes, I would say, how do you train your 5-year-old in the house about firearm safety? And they say, oh yeah, of course that's important, because we have these firearms and we need to make sure that they don't accidentally take them out, or if they run across a gun. So they're teaching firearm safety in their home with their hunting weapons. But the educators believe that, I think a lot of educators believe that it's too scary, and I don't even think it's the teachers as much as it is the administrators, school boards, who don't want to have to explain why their kid is getting gun safety training at schools, right? But I said in my book, not that anybody's ever noticed it, but I said, if you're going to have guns in schools, you should have gun safety training in schools. I just do.
Yeah, and because I don't know if the DARE program was a successful program, but I just remembered standing out so much in the late 80s.
But I think it was. I think that it was an important program, because I think you're a great example of it. You remember it. You probably remember what they talked about it, and that was all about drugs. Think about what we've taught people about suicide prevention.
Yeah, and
how important it is. How ingrained is our training in schools about suicide prevention and mental wellness? We're kind of just coming around to teaching that well. And I think a lot of people would want their kids to learn about the signs of suicide and how to support your friends and your family if you think that they're having troubles.
It's funny you say that, because I'm like, I didn't know anybody who was suicidal, but that's not the case. That's not because it wasn't predominantly taught.
Right.
We weren't educated.
You didn't know the signs.
Right. But it was happening. It was like, I think in my high school, there was like one from every class. Mm-hmm. Someone had passed away. One was a death by suicide, a car accident. Another one was, fatal. He was killed by his own, by a golf ball. It just like,
right.
But the suicide one was like, oh wow, that one hit pretty hard for us, and we're like, what was this? Because
And you know what we know now about suicide? Research shows that when there's one suicide, there'll be more. When there's a suicide in a family, there'll be suicides in families. And in knowing those kinds of warning signs has taught us a lot about how to watch for people. So let me just add this one extra fact. 30 to 40% of the active shooters intend to and often do commit suicide. We're looking for the same signs.
right. Well, I got to ask the $1 million question. I'm sure you've never heard this before.
I would pay you $1 million if it was a question I hadn't heard potentially, but no, I'm game. Do it.
All right. So as we get close to wrapping things up, this is the Pacific Northwest. We've had one of the most, this area came with its challenges, the doom and gloom, and people calling this the Prozac capital. And so the $1 million question for me, because I'd like to know and to get your thoughts on this. Did Kurt Cobain really shoot himself? Was that a suicide? Have you ever?
Now you're rolling back to my era, and I didn't believe it at the time, but
yeah,
I didn't pull the file at work. That's all I'm saying. So
right, it's interesting that there are stories out there that there are documentaries and there's different stories and there's different, it's just interesting that the case was closed rapidly. It was, and regardless if he was a junkie of the 90s of, heroin, which is grossly so badly, again, not something that was taught. It was like
misunderstood because of it. Right. Yeah. It was all misunderstood. The law's still on the books that, if you have a prescription for medical marijuana, you can't buy a gun under the law, under the federal laws. If you use marijuana, you can't buy, because according to the FDA, it is a highly addictive, no redeeming value, there is no medical potential or purpose behind that. That's the law right now.
As we wrap things up from the Pacific Northwest, I know you've probably never heard that question before. So I was like,
I haven't. I'll be sending you $1 million. You know what? It's hard. It's hard because it's hard. It was, it's hard to lose somebody, right?
For sure, especially at that young age. If you're a super fan or just a fan in general of the band or of any band, where said crisis happens, maybe it is like Amy Winehouse or
right. Robin Williams.
Right. Robin Williams,
who was talking to his wife that day and that morning, and then killed himself, which was devastating to his fans.
As we wrap things up, any last things, something that, someone should take away from your book or podcast as well that is available, I'm sure, on every platform available?
Yes, it is. It is available on every platform, Apple, Spotify, and wherever you find your podcast. That's what my co-podcaster from London always says. She's like, can't you just say that once in a while? I say
it all the time.
I forget it all the time. I'm just the worst at it. But here's what I would want you to take away if you're listening and you listened long enough to hear all these things that might make you scared about mass shootings or active shooters. We, in the last handful of years, have cut in half practically the casualties for these types of shootings because of two things, I think. Better police training and better training from civilians. Civilians who understand that they can control the situation. They can help end the shooting, or they can get away and save their life and the lives of others around them. Feel empowered by that, because there's more people whose lives are saved and just a handful who are killed in these situations.
And for those who are like, I grew up in the hood. If I run, I'm a little beep, they're like, don't be a little, whatever, and run. No. But in this case, in most businesses, I mean, it's crazy to say, in grocery stores, anywhere that it is, as you said, as a business, if you didn't catch most of this podcast or radio show or stream, go back and watch and listen, because there is some rich information. And you get to be the judge. You get to do, like, at the end of the day, people are going to do what they're going to want to do, right?
Yeah, and you know what? No one's watching you run. What do you think? You think they're judging your shoes or something? No one's going to watch you run away. They're all doing the same thing. So just go, take off.
Yeah, take off for sure. Again, thank you so much. Our guest tonight, who has spent some time with us this evening. Thank you for putting that video out virally, or to have it pushed out on a national level, because look what it did. It brought me to a situation where I was able to share that experience,
I
where
like that.
which is on your website. If you haven't had a chance, go check out her website. Everything will be linked in the podcast, wherever you download your podcast at.
And sign up for my email if you want, because what I'm trying to do is send out what to look for, the signs to look for, the things to look for. It's not all doom and gloom. You
All right.
can't do this. You can't do this for a living and be all doom and gloom.
They can find you on Twitter at
Kate Schwiet. Kate Schwiet. Yeah.
And at your website and so that one's actually KatherineSchwiet.com.
That's my real name, but all my social media handles are Kate Schwiet.
So if you missed it and you can't spell it, just go to the podcast, go to the YouTube channel, go to watch it. You'll see all the information linked in the bio down below.
Thank you. Yes.
And be sure to like, subscribe, and go to her podcast and download the podcast on all the podcast platforms, wherever they are.
It's fun. It's a fun podcast, she says about her murder podcast. It's very fun and very popular. And my co-host is from London, so she is a hoot.
I'm going to go check that out. And again, thank you so much. And we'd love to have you back on under different circumstances and more for training purposes. So I thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mario. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.